They told me the tape was blank the first 3 times they watched it. No sound, no picture, just a gray storm of static rolling across the screen like a curtain of dead snow. But on the 4th run, when the tech slowed the footage almost to a freeze frame, something appeared in the corner that should not have been there. A small hand flickered into view for less than a second, pale against the dark, and on the wrist was a bracelet made of blue beads, the same bracelet everyone swore had been buried in an empty child-sized coffin 25 years ago, the day this town tried to bury its own guilt along with the name Emma Reese. That was the moment the case stopped being just another cold file on my desk and turned into something else, something that didn't fit inside the lines of standard procedures and rational explanations. I'd spent more than 2 decades working cold cases, and you learn early that most mysteries end the same way people do, quietly, off stage, with more questions than answers, and nobody left to care. But that hand on the tape, reaching out of the static, wearing a dead girl's bracelet, pulled us out beyond what experience could explain, and into a place where you start to wonder whether you're chasing a criminal, a mistake, or something that doesn't have a box on the official forms. My name is Daniel Harper, and I work in the cold case unit attached to a small jurisdiction in Colorado, the kind of place that looks peaceful on a postcard until you start reading the reports. When I first saw the name Emma Reese on a fresh assignment memo, she was still 4 years old in the eyes of everyone who remembered her, frozen in time with pigtails and a red Christmas sweater. On paper, her disappearance was dated December 23, 1999. In reality, for this town, that winter night never really ended. The official story was simple enough to summarize in a press release. The Reese house stood on the edge of our town of Redwood Falls, right where the last streetlights ended and a long wall of pine trees began. Locals have always called that forest the line. Not a park, not a reserve, just the line, as if everyone quietly agreed that it marked a boundary between the world they understood and something they preferred to leave alone. It was the week before Christmas, snow hanging on the power lines, colored lights in every window, the kind of scene tourist brochures love. Inside that little house at the end of the road, a 4-year-old girl went to bed in a pink room full of dolls and plastic angels. And according to every report ever written about that night, she never woke up where her mother expected to find her. Around 2 in the morning, Emma's mother said she woke to a faint, unnatural sound, like something lightly tapping the window glass. She thought maybe it was tree branches in the wind, or ice slipping down the eaves, but the feeling that something was wrong was sharp enough to drag her completely out of sleep. She walked the short hallway, pushed open her daughter's door, and stepped into the kind of silence that never leaves a house once it moves in. The window over the small bed was open, rimmed with frost. A thin trail of snow dusted the sill, and the blankets were pushed aside on an empty mattress. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken lock, no splintered frame, no struggle. The only trace outside, as the first responding officer noted, were tiny bare footprints in the snow below the window, leading away from the house and toward the dark wall of the line. When I received the case box this January, somebody upstairs framed it as part of a renewed effort to show the public we still cared about our unsolved past. Maybe that was true, or maybe they just needed a name for the press conference. After 20 years in this job, you develop a certain cynicism about sudden bursts of institutional conscience. Cold cases aren't glamorous. They're like doing archaeology with other people's tragedies, brushing away dust to find out exactly how a heart broke and then was filed away. Still, when I opened that cardboard box, I realized right away that this case was not like the others, because on top of the standard folders and faded Polaroids, someone had placed a small clear evidence bag containing something that should not have existed. Inside the bag lay a child's bracelet, blue glass beads strung around a thin elastic cord, with a small silver snowflake charm hanging from the center. I had already seen that bracelet dozens of times in the photos inside the file. It was on Emma's wrist in almost every picture, the way some kids cling to one toy as if it's part of them. According to the documentation, the bracelet was placed inside a symbolic coffin when the family held a memorial service a year after her disappearance. A funeral with no body, because no remains had ever been found. Yet the tag on this evidence bag carried a date from last year, and the location where it was recovered was nowhere near the cemetery. The report said a group of teenagers had found the bracelet on top of an old abandoned water tower just outside town, a place they used for drinking beer and spray painting their frustrations. They said it wasn't hidden or dropped. It was laid out neatly on the railing at the highest platform, as if waiting for someone to discover it. Forensics had been able to pull a partial DNA profile from the skin cells on the beads, degraded, weak, but with one rare marker that matched an old reference sample taken from one of Emma's childhood hairbrushes still stored in deep archive. You can call it coincidence if that helps you sleep. I tried that for exactly one night. It didn't work. I don't like using the word impossible. In this line of work, impossible has a habit of turning into, we just didn't understand it yet, a few months or years later. Still, sitting in the lab with our forensic pathologist, explaining that the stranger's bracelet from the top of a rusted tower matched the girl whose bracelet was supposedly buried decades ago, I found myself saying it out loud. He just shrugged, slid the report across the table, and told me to sign for the evidence if I wanted to take it. We ran the tests again. The results did not change. That was when I went back to the oldest piece of non-evidence in the box, a VHS tape labeled with the name of a highway convenience store and a date just 2 days after the night Emma vanished. Back then, our department had logged the tape as corrupted and mostly snow, likely the result of bad equipment or a damaged cassette. Somebody had still copied it and dropped it in the box, maybe out of habit, maybe because no one wanted to throw away even a broken ghost of a clue. For 25 years, that tape had just sat there, a gray brick of magnetic dust. Now we had better technology, a digital forensics tech named Nate, who enjoyed making miracles out of noise, and a reason to look one more time. We digitized the footage and ran it through every filter our aging system could manage. The first pass was exactly what the original report described, a storm of static with brief flashes of shapes that could have been headlights, shelves, or pure imagination. The second and third attempts weren't much better. By the time we were on the fourth run, I was already mentally writing the memo that would send the tape back into storage. Then Nate paused, reversed, and slowed the clip down to an almost painful crawl. In the lower right corner of the frame, where an alley met the back of the store, the static parted just long enough to show movement. It wasn't a clear figure stepping into view or a face looking into the camera. It was a fragment, as if the tape had only been willing to surrender one small piece. A child's arm, raised slightly forward, the suggestion of a narrow shoulder, and around the tiny wrist a circle of faintly reflective beads caught whatever light the camera could still see. If you know what you're looking for, it won't let you dismiss it. I told Nate to freeze the frame and zoom as much as the resolution allowed. The result was grainy, murky, and still unmistakable to me. I had already memorized that bracelet, bead by bead, from the evidence photo book. I knew the way the snowflake charm hung a little lower than the rest, the way it tended to twist sideways. On the screen, in that ghostly frame, the charm seemed to drag down at the same angle. The hair on my arms rose, like I had just stepped outside without a coat. It's hard to explain what it feels like when your rational mind and your instincts start arguing in different directions. On one side, years of experience were shouting that video artifacts, pattern recognition, and desperation can make a person see what they need to see. On the other, something deeper and quieter was insisting that if I ignored this, I would regret it for the rest of my career. There is a point where you either treat your gut like another piece of evidence, or you admit that you're only pretending to care about the truth when it fits the paperwork. The next morning, I drove out to the old Reese house. The family had moved away long ago, and the property had changed hands more times than a losing poker chip. At some point, people stopped buying it to live in and started buying it to sell again later, until even that game dried up. Now it sat at the end of a crumbling street like a forgotten thought, its once white siding weathered to a tired gray and several windows boarded up. The charred outline of a fire scarred one side of the attached garage, the result of some teenage experiment with fireworks a few summers back, according to a report I'd skimmed. In every document, the building was called The Scene, but in town people still called it Emma's house, as if every other family that had tried to make a life that was just passing through her story. Talking to neighbors over the years, you see a pattern. They lower their voices when they mention the house, not because of superstition exactly, but because memory itself has made the place a kind of living grave marker. No one wants to say too much where it might be overheard by whatever is left of the past. The gate was secured with a cheap new padlock that wouldn't have slowed down a determined teenager, let alone a detective with authorization and a set of tools. I let myself in, telling that inner voice that worried about forms and signatures to sit down and be quiet for a while. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, and a stale wave of air rolled out that smelled of dust, mold, and the faintest trace of something sweet and artificial, like old holiday candles that had burned down to stubs years ago and never been properly aired out. Whoever had last owned the place had tried at some point to fix it up for sale. Newer wallpaper, peeled from the hallway in curling strips. Newer carpet had been laid over older carpet in the living room, and the kitchen cabinets bore the cheap shine of budget renovations. But Emma's room, according to every note I'd read and every neighbor I'd interviewed over the years on other cases, had never really taken to new occupants. One set of owners had turned it into a storage room and still refused to enter it after dark. Another had tried to repaint and give it to their own little girl, who slept there exactly 3 nights before asking to move to the smaller guest room down the hall. The door to that room stuck when I tried it, swollen with age and humidity, and I had to throw my shoulder against it twice before the frame finally surrendered with a dry groan. The air inside was colder, sharply enough that I noticed it right away. The walls were a tired, uneven pink, the color bleeding in places where someone had half-heartedly tried to cover old childish drawings. There was no furniture left, no bed, no toys, no curtains, just a naked window facing the tree line and a faint darker ring on one wall where a small lamp had once cast its circle of comfort. I walked to the window and looked out. The line stretched away, exactly as I'd seen it 1,000 times from the road. Tall pines standing shoulder to shoulder, the ground between them choked with needles and shadow. In daylight, it could have passed for picturesque, something you might put on a brochure advertising rustic charm. Standing in a dead child's room, knowing those tiny footprints had once led straight from the sill into that dark, it looked less like nature and more like an open mouth waiting at the edge of town. When I leaned down, I noticed 2 thin parallel scratches running almost the entire length of the painted sill, right where small hands might press for balance while climbing through. They were not deep, but they were clean, the paint along the edges slightly brighter than the rest of the dull surface, as if whatever had made them was more recent than everything around them. I ran my fingertip along one groove and felt the roughness of metal under a thin layer of paint, not the smooth erosion of old wear, but the fresh bite of something sharp. In that moment, a part of me expected my phone to ring with news that would reduce all of this to an error. Maybe the tape had been misstated. Maybe the bracelet was a convincing fake. Maybe the lab had contaminated the samples. Skepticism is a kind of armor in this job, and mine was rattling, looking for something to latch onto. The phone stayed silent. The house did not. Out in the narrow hallway just beyond the bedroom door, a single overhead bulb hung from a cracked fixture. I hadn't touched the switch, and I knew from the breaker box I'd checked downstairs that the power was cut to the whole structure. Yet as I stepped out of the room, the filament in that bulb gave the faintest flicker. Not enough to call it light, just a suggestion of it, like the last blink of an eye in a dark room. I froze, listening harder than I had in years. Somewhere below, a door thudded as if caught by a draft, a perfectly ordinary sound in an old, empty house. Wind hissed through unseen gaps in the window frames as a front moved in over the pines outside. Then, from directly behind me, from the very window I had just examined, came a soft, brittle noise that I recognized with a clarity that made my skin crawl, the delicate, unmistakable tap of a nail or a small knuckle brushing once against cold glass. I do not believe in ghosts in a professional sense. Belief complicates things you need to see clearly, and the job trains you to file strange experiences under coincidence, unless proven otherwise. But I also know a pattern when I hear one. The mother's statement in the original report mentioned that very sound is the thing that woke her, that pulled her out of a dream and into a nightmare. I found myself turning back toward the room, despite every sensible instinct telling me to finish my survey and leave. Of course, the window was exactly as I'd left it when I stepped back inside, closed, cracked along one edge, rimmed with dirt. Nothing waited there but my own reflection in the dull glass, older and more tired than I felt like admitting. Something in me, maybe the part that still remembered being a child alone in the dark, pushed me to do something foolish. I cleared my throat and spoke into the empty pink room, my voice sounding too loud and too small at the same time. "Emma," I said, and the name felt heavier than 4 letters ought to feel. "If you're here, I'm listening." Silence pressed back, thick and unbroken. No whisper, no sudden drop in temperature, no spinning lampshade or flying objects to make for a good story later. I stood there feeling ridiculous, a 50-year-old man with 2 ex-wives, a bad lower back, and more open files than weekends left before retirement, talking to peeling paint and cracked glass. I almost laughed at myself, and maybe I would have, if my phone hadn't chosen that exact second to shiver in my pocket. The caller ID showed Nate's name. I answered on the second ring. "Harper," I said, trying to sound like I hadn't just been holding a one-sided conversation with a house. "Donnie L., you need to come back to the lab," Nate said without any preamble, his voice pitched higher than usual. "Right now." "What is it?" I asked, glancing once more at the window. I pushed the footage through another filter set, the one we use for low-light body cam reconstruction, he said. "There's more than just the arm. There's something behind her." "Behind who?" I asked, though I already knew what he meant. "Behind the girl," he said. "Behind Emma, or whoever that is. Look, I don't know how to describe this without sounding crazy, but there's a shape in the frame at the very edge. It's not an artifact. It's too consistent between the frames we can salvage. It's tall, taller than the doorframe behind it. It looks like a shadow standing where there shouldn't be anything at all. For a heartbeat, I said nothing. The old house seemed to lean in around me, waiting for my reaction, a silence as thick as insulation. Then I told him to save every version, not to share the file with anyone else yet, and that I'd be back within the hour. As I ended the call, my eyes drifted to a faint circle of cleaner paint on the bedroom wall, where a child's nightlight had once glowed, a pale halo that had outlived everything it was meant to comfort. Below that circle, at exactly the height a small hand might reach, the paint was slightly discolored, worn by years of touches no one had thought important enough to record. I moved closer and raised my palm to it, pressing my skin against the wall. The plaster felt colder than the air around it, a thin, dry chill that had nothing to do with the failing winter sun or the poor insulation. It felt, in a way I didn't particularly appreciate, like the temperature you notice in a room just after someone leaves it. Not the presence of warmth, but the echo of it. There are details you cannot put into an official report without turning the whole document into a joke. Details that live in the margins of your memory instead. That cold spot on the wall joined them as I finally stepped away and headed for the front door. Outside, the sky over the pines had shifted into the bruised colors that come right before dark in a Colorado winter. That thin, dangerous hour when the world is still technically day, but already thinking like night. The line waited at the edge of the property, a black seam between town and wilderness. As I walked down the cracked front path toward my car, another thought slid quietly into place, as unwelcome as it was persistent. For 25 years, the official story of the Reese case had been a child who somehow left her bed in the middle of a winter night and vanished into the forest, swallowed by weather, wild animals, or a human monster who left no trace. Now there was a bracelet that had come back from nowhere, a video of a girl's hand reaching out of static where no one should have been, and a shadow taller than any man standing just behind her on the edge of a roadside camera's failing vision. Whatever had taken Emma Reese that night, whether you called it a person, a force, or a place, it didn't seem particularly interested in staying buried. And as much as I wanted to believe that this was just another cruel coincidence in a world full of them, I couldn't shake the feeling that, for reasons I didn't yet understand, the case hadn't simply resurfaced. It had been allowed to surface. Someone or something was ready for us to start looking again. The first time something truly impossible happens in your line of work, your brain does its best to stuff it into a familiar box. Faulty footage, lab contamination, witness misremembering events after too many years and too many retellings. Driving back from Emma's house toward the station, with the pines of the line sliding past on my left like an endless row of dark shoulders, I tried every one of those explanations on like old coats. None of them fit. The bracelet in my evidence locker had no right to exist. The marks on the windowsill looked too fresh for a room that had been empty for years. And now Nate was talking about a shadow taller than a doorframe, standing behind a girl who never made it to 5 years old. The heater in my car rattled, blowing lukewarm air at my knees, and for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't just working a case. The case had started working me. The cold case unit in our building lives in the forgotten wing, down a hall where the paint stops pretending to be new. It suited me fine. Dead cases and aging detectives both do their best work when nobody is watching too closely. Nate's domain was a cramped room off our corridor, lined with second-hand monitors and equipment that the main lab had decided was too old to keep, but too valuable to throw away. I found him hunched in front of 3 screens, headphones around his neck, dark hair sticking up like he'd been running his hands through it for the past hour. He didn't turn when I stepped in, which told me more than any greeting. "Tell me this is just the world's ugliest glitch," I said, closing the door behind me. "Lie to me if you have to, Nate. I'm old. I deserve it," he answered without looking back. "If it's a glitch, it's the most consistent one I've ever seen," he muttered. And consistency, last time I checked, is what we call a pattern. Only then did he swivel his chair enough to meet my eyes, and the expression on his face was the kind you see in people who have just realized their comfort zone has an off-ramp they didn't know about. "I cleaned up as much of the noise as I could," he added, gesturing at the center monitor. "You need to watch this from the top." The footage started the same way I remembered it, a field of gray static with occasional ghost shapes moving behind it, the frozen eye of the camera staring out at the back lot of the convenience store. A dumpster sat in one corner, barely visible through the digital snow, and beyond that, the edge of a sloping hill that fell toward a drainage ditch. Nate had overlaid a time stone, December 25th, 1999, 2:43 a.m. Christmas morning, for anyone still counting. For several long seconds, nothing happened, and I almost opened my mouth to tell him he'd overreacted. Then the static flickered, parted like someone drawing back a sheer curtain, and the scene sharpened just enough. At the edge of the frame, a small figure came into being in stages, first as a smudge, then as motion, and finally as the unmistakable outline of a little girl in what looked like a nightgown or oversized T-shirt, bare legs gleaming faintly in the harsh outdoor lighting. She was turned partly away from the camera, her face a suggestion more than a detail, but the size, the way her shoulders tilted, the way her hair fell around her head in two uneven bunches, it all matched the photographs burned into my mind. Her right arm reached forward, out of the frame, toward something or someone the camera couldn't see. On that wrist, even in the graying, the beads caught the light, a broken circle of tiny, intermittent stars. "That's where you stopped me before," I said quietly, more to myself than to Nate. "Yeah," he replied, his fingers already moving toward the keyboard. "This time, keep watching." He stepped the footage forward frame by frame. The girl didn't move much, just a shift of balance here. A tiny jerk of her head there, like someone listening hard. In one frame, her mouth was slightly open. In the next, her shoulders seemed to tense. And then, behind her, the darkness at the edge of the wall ceased being just absence and began to take a shape. It started as a vertical line, as if the shadows had decided to agree on a border. Then a second line appeared at an angle, and my eyes, long trained to recognize human forms from the barest of cues, did the rest without asking my permission. What I was seeing was too tall, too broad at the upper half, and too narrow at the base to be a reflection of any shelf or door. There was no light source position to cast such a thing, and yet there it was, the suggestion of a head, shoulders, and arms, standing so close behind the girl that they might as well have been touching, except there was no contact I could see. "You see that?" Nate asked, though he already knew the answer. "I do," I said. My voice came out lower than usual. "Run it one more time." He did, this time at a slightly faster speed. The shadow didn't flicker the way artifacts usually do. It held its general shape even when the static surged, like a stain beneath a layer of dirty glass. As the girl's hand moved forward, the shadow's outline seemed to lean with her, a half-second delayed, as if echoing her motion. There were no eyes, no face I could describe, but somewhere at the top of that ink-black mass, the slight tilt suggested attention. "Check the environment?" I asked, forcing myself back into the role I knew best. No structures behind that wall, no tall signs, no moving equipment. Nate clicked through a series of overlays. "I pulled daytime footage from the same camera a week later," he said. "Same angle, same lot, same wall. No shadow. Nothing to cast it. This camera was mounted under the roof overhang. There's no way a passing truck could have parked at that height. And if it was a person, we'd see some separation from the wall, at least at the legs, but it just blends in, like it's part of the dark. Could be a double exposure," I offered, though without much conviction. "Bad tape, something recorded over something else. It would have to be the world's luckiest double exposure," he said, leaning forward. "Because the frames where the girl and this shape appear together line up perfectly in timing, angle, and scale. I ran an analysis. If it's an overlay, it's the neatest one I've seen from a cheap security system in '99. We watched the last few seconds in silence. At the very end, the girl's head turned, more fully this time, as if she heard something to her, right from the camera. The bracelet flared briefly as her wrist rotated. Then, in one stuttering jump of the tape, both she and the shadow were gone. The static flooded back in, heavier than before, as if whatever had been there had taken even the leftover light with it. I became aware that my hands had curled into fists. Slowly, I loosened them. "Copy everything to an external drive," I said. "Label it with the case number, then lock it up. No open network, no cloud, nothing that can walk out of here on its own." Nate looked like he wanted to argue, and then thought better of it. You think we've got something good? He asked instead. I mean, strictly from a job security standpoint, this is the coolest thing I've ever pulled off. I let out a breath that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. From that standpoint, yeah, you're a magician, I said. From mine, I'm not sure yet if we're dealing with a breakthrough or a hallucination recorded on magnetic tape. I glanced back at the frozen image of the empty lot, feeling suddenly as if the absence that was staring at us. Either way, we're not leaking it to the press as proof of anything. Not until we understand more. Back at my desk, the case file waited like a patient animal. I spent the next few hours doing the only thing that ever calms me down, going backward. Reports, interviews, supplemental notes, every scrap of detail from the initial investigation and the years of false leads that followed. The Reese family had been dissected repeatedly by law enforcement, by the media, by bored armchair detectives on early message boards. The father was ruled out by alibis and polygraphs. The mother lived under an invisible microscope for a decade anyway. Neighbors were questioned about every strange car, every unfamiliar face, every argument heard through thin winter walls. Somewhere in all that noise, if this wasn't just whatever my brain was whispering it might be, there had to be something we'd missed. One series of notes caught my attention, not because of what they proved, but because of how casually they'd been set aside. A deputy's log from the week before Emma disappeared mentioned 3 separate calls from residents on the edge of town reporting strange lights near the line after midnight. At the time, those had been shrugged off as teenagers with flashlights or hunters out of season. The deputy's handwriting grew less patient with each entry, the way cops do when they feel their time is being wasted. No follow-up. No names attached, just street references and brief descriptions. Saw a glow moving between trees. Heard humming sound, like power lines. Felt house shake, no quake recorded. I made copies and laid them next to the photographs of the Reese backyard, the open window, the tracks in the snow. My mind kept circling back to the same problem. You can chase human monsters because they leave human traces. Motives, mistakes, habits. But what do you do when the outline at the edge of the frame refuses to behave like anything recognizable? At some point in the late afternoon, when the winter light outside my own office window had already faded to that flat blue that makes you feel like you're inside an aquarium, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Nate or Command, but a number I hadn't seen in years and had hoped not to see again often. I considered letting it go to voicemail, then reminded myself that avoiding the past wasn't exactly working out for me this week. I picked up. "Harper," I said. "Danny?" A woman's voice answered, roughened by cigarettes and time, but still carrying a tone that brought back a rush of old arguments. "It's Allison." "Don't hang up." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "You've got about 10 seconds before I start charging billable hours," I said, trying to keep it light. "What's up?" She didn't laugh. "I saw your name," she said, "on the news crawl yesterday. They said the department was reopening the Reese case and that you were heading the review." There was a pause, in which I could almost hear her lighting a cigarette. "You still work in that graveyard of yours?" "Cold case," I corrected automatically. "And yeah, that's me. Didn't know you watched local news." "I don't," she replied. "My sister does. She called me." Sighed. "Isn't that the guy you used to know who is obsessed with?" She trailed off, then exhaled. "Doesn't matter. Listen, I wouldn't be calling if it was just about you popping up on TV. It's about the case. Last I checked, you were working missing persons in Denver," I said. "You got something relevant, or are we taking a nostalgic tour down bad decision lane?" This time there was a short, humorless chuckle. "Still charming, I see," she said. "No, this isn't nostalgia. I had a file cross my desk last month, a welfare check that turned weird. Family living on the north side called in, said their 4-year-old daughter had started talking in her sleep. You know how these go, right? Usually it's just a scared parent and a bad dream. But then the mom mentions the name the kid keeps repeating. Allison took a drag, and the pause stretched just enough to tighten a knot between my shoulders. She keeps saying she's playing with Emma from the Christmas house. I closed my eyes for a second. Kids pick up names, I said. Parents talk, TV, internet. Mom swears she never talked about the case around her. Allison cut in. Dad, neither. And here's the part you're really going to hate. This kid? She keeps waking up at the same time every night. Between 2:30 and 2:45. Screaming about someone tapping at her window and telling her it's time to go to the trees. There was a rustle on the line. I pictured her flipping through a folder. They live 3 blocks from the line, Danny, on the opposite side of town from the Reese place, but still within spitting distance of those woods. For a moment, my office felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in by an inch. The clock on my desk ticked louder than usual, though I knew that was just my ears deciding to notice it. "You've checked for prowlers?" I asked. "Creeps peeking in windows? That kind of thing?" "Of course," she said. "Patrols, cameras, motion sensors, nothing. Footage shows the girl thrashing in her sleep and then sitting up, looking at the window like she sees something there, but there's nothing on the exterior cams. Tracks outside are just the usual cats, raccoons, a stray dog, no bare little feet in the snow." She let that sink in. "Look, I'm not calling to tell you a ghost story. I'm telling you because when I tried to pull your old notes on weird reports near the line, half the boxes are in your dungeon, and half are in some off-site hellhole no one's labeled correctly. You've been living with that forest on your doorstep for 20 years. I figured if anyone had a pattern wall about it in his head, it was you." I pinched the bridge of my nose, feeling the beginnings of a headache settle behind my eyes. "You send me what you've got?" I asked. "Full report, video, everything. And I'll dig on my end. But Allison, don't feed this to anyone upstairs yet. If this is nothing, we don't need to start a panic about haunted timber. If it's something, we need to come at it clean. I already took a risk calling you directly," she said. "So no, I'm not rushing to our chief with 'the trees are whispering.' I'll send the file. And Danny? Yeah? If there's a line out there no one's supposed to cross," she said softly, "maybe make sure you don't plant both feet on the wrong side of it. Some places, they don't give you back what you bring in." When the call ended, I sat there for a long moment, listening to the quiet hum of the building. I thought about the circle of brighter paint in Emma's room, where a nightlight had once burned. I thought about a bracelet on a tower, a shadow on a tape, a child in another town waking at the same time every night, saying another girl's name. Then I did what any sensible old detective does when the road he's on starts to tilt in a direction he doesn't completely trust. I went looking for someone who remembered how it all began, before the story had time to rot and grow old ghosts. In the original file, tucked behind official statements and typed transcripts, there was a handwritten letter from a woman named Margaret Lewis. At the time of Emma's disappearance, she had lived 2 houses down from the Reese family. She'd been interviewed once, her statements summarized and mostly ignored. But the letter, written 6 months later, hadn't been included in any of the investigative flowcharts. The previous detective had stapled it to the back of the file with a note: grief, hysteria, possible mental decline. In other words, not worth their time. Her address, according to a quick database search, hadn't changed. People like Margaret don't usually leave. They grow roots, even if the soil is full of bones. I grabbed my coat, signed the evidence log for the bracelet on my way out, some part of me unwilling to leave it, completely alone, and headed back into the cold. Margaret's house was the kind that looked permanently half-prepared for Christmas, even in November. Faded plastic reindeer crowded the front porch, one missing an antler. another leaning drunkenly against a cracked pillar. The wreath on the door had long since surrendered its color, but someone had patched it with newer red ribbons, a stubborn refusal to let time dictate everything. I knocked and heard a television shut off almost immediately, followed by the cautious shuffle of feet and the whisper of a chain being unhooked. She opened the door just far enough to see me, and widened it with a nod when I held up my badge. Her hair was thinner than in the file photos, snow white now, but her eyes were still sharp, the kind that had watched a street and a forest for most of a lifetime. "You're here about Emma," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Took you long enough. That obvious?" I asked, stepping inside when she gestured me through. "In this town?" she said, closing the door behind us. "When the police come calling on an old woman after all these years, it's either because she's finally died and they're at the wrong house, or because the past has decided it's bored." She motioned me toward a worn sofa. "Sit." I made coffee. "It's terrible, but it's hot." The living room was crowded with framed photographs, children, grandchildren, Christmases stacked on Christmases, but on one shelf, slightly apart from the rest, was a single picture of a little girl in a red sweater, smiling with the total, unself-conscious joy only 4-year-olds and some dogs can manage. Emma, with her blue bracelet gleaming on her wrist. The sight of it, after all the static and shadows, grounded me in a way no lab result could. "You wrote a letter," I said, wrapping my hands around the mug she handed me. "6 months after Emma disappeared. You said there were things you hadn't told the officers at the time because they didn't know how to listen." I met her gaze. "I'm here to listen." She settled into an armchair across from me, her fingers worrying the edge of a crocheted blanket. For a moment, she seemed to weigh me, measuring whether I was the same kind of wall she'd hit before. Then she nodded once, almost to herself. "The night before Emma disappeared," she began, "I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard since I was a girl. My daddy used to say the forest has moods, you know. Most nights it just breathes, but sometimes, when the air is wrong and the ground's thinking about shifting, it hums. Real low, like a power line you can feel in your teeth. That night, I heard it again. House shook just a bit. Nothing fell off the shelves. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make the glasses in the cabinet kiss. I thought of the deputy's old notes about a humming sound near the line. You told this to the officer who came by?" I asked. She snorted softly. "Oh, I tried." He wrote it down and then patted my hand like I'd told him the fairies were dancing on my roof. Said maybe it was a truck on the highway, or a small quake the instruments missed. Maybe it was. Maybe I am just an old woman filling in the blanks. But then I saw something else, and that part 1 no was real, because I've never been that sober and that scared at the same time in my life. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, eyes locked on mine. 2 nights after the search parties gave up on the forest, I looked out my bedroom window around 3 in the morning. Couldn't sleep. Grief hangs in the air heavy, you know, like fog. I saw. Light, not flashlights, not car beams. It was like someone had drawn a thin line of white between the trees at the edge of the Reese yard. It moved along the ground, slow, back and forth, like it was looking for something. Or someone. And just for a second, Danny, she caught herself. Harper. Just for a second, I saw a little shape standing where that light ended, small, with bare legs and a white nightgown, and something taller behind her, where it should still have been dark. My grip tightened around the mug. "Why didn't you insist they come back?" I asked. "Call again. Demand someone take another look." Her laugh this time was bitter. "Oh, I did. I called." They searched. They found tire tracks from their own cars, prints from their own boots, and nothing else. And every time I talked about the light and the shadow, they marked another unspoken tally in the old and confused column. So I learned to shut up. She glanced toward the shelf with Emma's picture. Until I heard on the radio yesterday they're opening the case again. Names like weeds popping back up. I thought maybe, just maybe, someone might come by who understood that not everything you can't explain is a lie. I took a slow breath, the coffee cooling in my hands. What do you think the line is, Mrs. Lewis? I asked. To you, personally. After all these years. She looked past me then, toward the front window, where the tops of the pines were just visible over the roofs. I think there are places where the world is thin, she said softly, where what's on one side can see what's on the other. And sometimes, if the time is wrong and the door is weak, something reaches through. Maybe it's just a feeling. Maybe it's more. All I know is kids went missing once or twice before Emma, long ago, back when folks still blamed wolves and wandering men. Every time, people whispered about the forest. Every time, the forest just stood there, close and patient. Her words settled over the room like another layer of dust, fine but impossible to ignore. I stood, set the untouched coffee on the table, and thanked her for her time, promising, this time honestly, that what she'd told me would not just be stapled to the back of a file and forgotten. She walked me to the door, and as I stepped out onto the porch, she added one last thing. You know what we used to tell our kids when they were little? She said, about the line? We told them, don't go into the trees when they're humming. And if you ever hear someone tapping on your window after midnight, you come get Mama, no matter what the voice says. Emma was a good girl. She listened. That's what keeps me up at night, Mr. Harper. Her gaze was steady. If she didn't open that window herself, something else opened it for her. Driving away from Margaret's house, the pines of the line rose on the horizon like a wall built for something larger than people. The logical part of my brain cataloged everything I'd heard as anecdotal, emotionally colored, unprovable. Another part, the older, quieter part that remembered walking alone at 6 years old and feeling watched by nothing I could name, filed it differently. I had a bracelet that had come back from nowhere, a videotape showing a girl and a shadow that didn't match any normal physics, a child in another town waking to the same time and the same terror, and now an old woman who claimed the forest could hum. Somewhere in the overlap of those stories, there was a pattern, and whatever shape it was beginning to take, it felt less and less like a man with a van or a bad decision in the wrong night. It felt, in a way I didn't care for at all, like the outline of something that had been patient for a very long time and had finally decided it was done waiting. The first time you decide to walk straight into the heart of something you don't understand, it usually doesn't feel heroic. It feels like indigestion, a headache, and the quiet realization that no one sane would follow the chain of logic you've just persuaded yourself to accept. By the time I pulled back into the station lot with Margaret Lewis's words still echoing in my head, I had already convinced myself that whatever was happening near the line, it needed a pair of boots on the ground after dark. The trick was figuring out whether those boots should belong to me, or whether I should let some younger, less breakable soul volunteer for the honor. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of getting old in this job is that you can hear yourself thinking things like, I can't ask someone else to do what I'm not willing to do myself, and occasionally you even mean it. Back upstairs, a new email sat in my inbox from Allison, marked with enough red flags to start its own parade. She had sent over the Denver file, the family near their own slice of wooded edge, the 4-year-old waking at almost exactly the same time every night, the reports of tapping on glass and whispered invitations to come see the trees. There were videos attached, and for a minute or two I debated whether to open them in the safety of my office or drag Nate in as a buffer. In the end, I opted for privacy. Some things you need to see alone first, before you let anyone else's reactions change the way your gut responds. The first clip was from a baby monitor camera, the kind designed to soothe nervous parents with grainy night vision images of their offspring doing absolutely nothing. The timestamp in the corner Read 2:37 a.m. The little girl, name redacted in the shared file, but let's call her Lily, lay tangled in her blankets, face turned toward the window. For almost a full minute, she slept restlessly, small fingers twitching, legs kicking at invisible threats. Then, with the abruptness of a pulled puppet string, she sat bolt upright. Her head snapped toward the window with such focus that I felt my own shoulders tense. Nothing moved on the screen except Lily. No tricks of shadow, no creeping figure outside, no glow sneaking around the curtains. Her mouth opened, forming a word the low-grade microphone barely caught. Emma? She repeated it twice, a little louder each time, as if reassuring herself that the name belonged to someone who could hear it. Then she smiled in a way that did not belong to a child just startled out of sleep by a bad dream. It was the shy, pleased smile of someone recognizing a friend at the door. "Can't," she whispered after a moment, eyes still fixed on something just out of frame. Mommy said no. There was a pause. She listened again, small head tilted. "But it's cold. You should come inside." Her hand, tiny and sure, reached toward the edge of the mattress, fingers sliding off and down as though searching for the floor. The video cut there, per the parents' selection, which was probably for the best. It left room for doubt, for simple human explanations. It also left enough fear to power a small city. The second clip was from a hallway camera Allison's people had installed after the parents begged for more security. Same time window, different angle. It showed Lily's bedroom door from the outside. At 2:39 a.m., the knob turned halfway, then stopped. It didn't open. For 10 full seconds, it just quivered, as if a small hand couldn't quite make up its mind or couldn't quite find the strength. Then the movement ceased, and everything went still again. No adult footsteps, no silhouettes, no pets. Just the barest mechanical confession that someone or something had tried to come out and decided against it. I watched both videos twice more, taking notes the second time like I could cross-examine an electrical signal. When I was done, I forwarded them to Nate with a short message. Run your usual checks. Look for anomalies, tampering, anything that says this is a hoax in bold letters. And if you find nothing, don't tell anyone else. Come see me. Then I pushed back from my desk and stared at the wall for a while, where a map of Redwood Falls and its surrounding wilderness had long since become more thumbtack than paper. The line, in all its unremarkable cartographic glory, wrapped around the town's northern and western edges like a crooked arm. The Reese house had rested almost exactly at the bend of that arm, where the trees came closest to the last row of houses. The Denver family in Allison's file lived near a different patch of woods, miles away, but the stories felt like echoes of each other. A window, a voice, a summons toward the trees at an hour when no one should be awake. Patterns again, whether I wanted them or not. By the time the sky outside shifted into full dark, I had made my choice. I signed out one of the department SUVs, logged an unofficial field reconnaissance entry that would satisfy anyone who wasn't inclined to dig deeper, and drove back out toward the edge of town. The Reese house crouched under the winter moon like it had been waiting for me all day, its broken windows reflecting just enough light to suggest eyes in the dark. I didn't go inside this time. I already knew what was in their cold walls, older grief and questions. Tonight, my attention belonged to the line itself. There's a point where the asphalt gives up pretending to be road and becomes cracked, then dirt, then nothing. I parked just before that transition and stepped out into the kind of cold that gnaws at your lungs. My breath puffed white in the air, disappearing as quickly as it formed, like any other temporary proof that I was still here. Ahead, the pines rose in ranks, the undergrowth knitted tightly between their trunks. The forest had no intention of making it easy for anyone to venture in. Good. I wasn't looking for easy. I stood at the edge for a long minute, just listening. At first, There was only the ordinary. Wind in the branches, the faraway hiss of the highway, the tired complaint of a loose piece of metal on a nearby telephone pole. Then, gradually, another sound made itself known, so low that if I hadn't been expecting it, I might have chalked it up to my imagination. It was a vibration more than a noise, a faint, continuous thread in the air that seemed to settle into my teeth and the bones behind my ears. A hum, Margaret had called it. Like power lines, only there were no towers here, no cables stringing overhead. Just trees, earth, and something old enough to be patient. Probably the wind, I muttered to myself, because sometimes saying it out loud keeps the fear from getting ideas. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow tunnel into the darkness, and stepped over the invisible boundary where neat suburban yards ended and the forest floor began. The temperature seemed to drop another few degrees the instant my boots hit the carpet of needles. The air smelled of sap, damp soil, and something faintly metallic, like old coins. People who don't spend a lot of time in woods at night imagine it as silent. It's not. It's full of tiny lives still going about their business, regardless of whether you're there to witness them. Twigs snapped in the distance, maybe from deer or raccoons. An owl called once and then changed its mind. Somewhere off to my right, a smaller creature scurried away from my light. All of that was normal. What wasn't normal was the way the hum seemed to grow steadier the deeper I walked, keeping pace with my heartbeat, warping my sense of distance so that every step felt both too long and not long enough. I kept my direction fixed by lining myself up with the faint glow of town lights behind me. I wasn't interested in getting lost. I just wanted to reach the point where, according to the old topographical maps, the land dipped slightly into a shallow depression, a natural ball in the forest floor that rainwater sometimes pooled in before seeping away. In Margaret's letter, she had described the strange light she'd seen as moving along the ground like it was following an old path. If there was a place where paths converged, this was it. After 10 minutes of careful progress, the ground underfoot began to slope. My flashlight picked out a cluster of rocks and fallen branches that looked almost deliberately arranged, though I knew enough about human pattern, seeking to distrust that impression. At the bottom of the shallow hollow, the trees opened up a little, their trunks forming a ragged circle around a patch of thinner undergrowth. Snow had settled more thickly here, unbroken by animal tracks. It was as if everything else in the forest had decided this spot belonged to something else. I stopped at the edge of the hollow, suddenly unwilling to step into the untouched snow. Not because I believed I would disturb some ancient sacred ground, but because I had the irrational sense that whatever marks I left would be studied later by eyes I didn't want on me. Instead, I swept my flashlight beam slowly around the perimeter, looking for any sign of human activity. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, the usual signatures of bored teenagers. There were none. No litter, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been here in a long time. Okay, I said into the cold, because talking to empty spaces had become a habit this week. Show me why you needed a bracelet and a videotape in 25 years. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the hum in the air shifted, not louder, exactly, but closer. It felt like standing opposite a speaker turned low, where you feel the bass tremble your ribs, even if you can't quite make out the tune. My flashlight flickered once, twice, and then steadied. The beam brushed past something near the far side of the hollow, and between one heartbeat and the next, I realized I was no longer alone. At first, all I saw was a smear of movement, a patch of darkness that didn't match the surrounding shapes. I slowed my breathing, narrowed my eyes, and let my training filter out the urge to panic. The shape resolved gradually into the outline of a figure standing half hidden behind a tree trunk, small and narrow, at about the height of a child. My pulse spiked. The beam of the flashlight trembled a fraction, painting the figure's edge in shaky white. Emma? The name left my mouth before I had time to censor it. It sounded absurd, theatrical, like something from one of those documentaries that dramatize what they can't prove. Still, once it was out there, it hung in the air between us, another presence. The figure did not move. It didn't flinch or run. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped a little more into the open, and my brain did its best to supply details that the dark stubbornly refused to clarify. Bare legs, pale in the circle of light. A white garment, hanging to mid-thigh. Hair falling forward around a face I could not quite see. One arm hung at its side. The other was bent slightly, the hand lifting as if to shield its eyes from a sun that wasn't there. On the wrist of that raised hand, something glinted faintly. The part of me that had seen too many dead children in too many awful contexts braced for the smell, the impossible slump of decay. It never came. The air remained cold, clean, and sharp. The figure, the girl, tilted her head as if she were studying me right back. A forest around us held its breath. For a heartbeat, for two, the world narrowed to the beam of my flashlight and the space it defined. "Emma," I said again, more quietly this time. "If that's you, I'm here to help. I want to know what happened to you." The hum rose, a half step up, the way a song approaches a chorus. The girl's hand lifted another inch, then another. I realized with a jolt that she wasn't shielding her eyes. She was reaching out, toward me. The same gesture I'd seen on the tape, a small arm extended towards something just outside the frame. I had become the frame. Some deeply embedded instinct screamed at me to step back, to turn and walk out of the trees and never come back. Another, equally strong in its own way, told me that this was why I was here, why the bracelet had resurfaced, why the tape had survived, why a girl in Denver was waking up whispering to someone only she could see. I stayed where I was. I did not reach back. My voice, when it came, was almost steady. "What's behind you?" I asked. Her head twitched, the movement sharper now, more like a glitch than a gesture. The outline of her shoulders stiffened, and for the first time, I noticed a distortion at the edge of my vision, as if the air just behind her was thicker than the rest. I shifted the flashlight, just a fraction, and the beam slid over something that was not a tree, not a branch, not any trick of winter light. It was taller than she was, much taller. It stood just behind her left shoulder, so close that if it had been solid, it would have cast her entirely into shadow. Instead, it clung to her outline like smoke over glass. My throat went dry. "You don't have to go with it," I said, not even sure who I was talking to anymore. "You don't have to go anywhere." The hum peaked then, so intense that my teeth rattled. The flashlight's beam sputtered and died, plunging the hollow into near total darkness. For a moment, I could see nothing at all, only feel the cold rush of air, as if something large had moved past me without touching. The smell of metal intensified, thick and sharp, like blood and broken circuits. Every instinct screamed that something had just shifted position, that something had just noticed me in a way it hadn't before. When the light came back, a brief, panicked smack of my hand against the flashlight casing brought it sputtering to life again. The hollow was empty. No girl, no towering outline. Just snow, trees, and the same circle of disturbed needles where my boots had been. The hum faded slowly, like a plane flying out of earshot. My hands shook, and I hated that they did, but there was no point lying about it, at least not to myself. I stood there longer than I probably should have, trying to convince myself that stress, grief, and too many hours staring at old case files had finally given me the kind of waking hallucination the department shrink always warned us about. But the bruising tightness in my chest, the way my body had reacted without my consent, told a different story. Whatever I had just encountered in that hollow, my nervous system had filed it under real enough to be afraid of. Eventually, practicality won out over morbid curiosity. I checked my watch, noted the time, 2:43 a.m., because of course it was, and forced my legs to carry me back out of the forest. Every tree I passed looked the same in the flashlight beam, but I had the unshakable impression of being walked to the edge, like a guest being escorted out by a host who is done entertaining for the night. When I finally broke through the last line of pines and stepped back onto the ragged edge of pavement, the ordinary world felt almost offensively bright. Streetlights buzzed, a dog barked 2 streets over, and somewhere a television blared the canned laughter of people who had never heard the forest hum. I leaned against the SUV for a minute, letting the cold air slap some sense back into me, then climbed in and drove home instead of returning to the station. Some conversations need to wait until morning, when nightmares lose a little of their shine. Sleep was a joke. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second in the hollow, the way the figure had moved or hadn't, the scale of the darkness behind her, the precise moment my flashlight failed. Around 3:30, I gave up, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, writing everything down before time and fear could soften the edges. By the time dawn started bleeding into the sky, my notes filled 6 pages, half observation, half confession. One sentence, written near the bottom of the last page, stood out when I read it back later. If that was Emma, she is not alone, and whatever has her does not like being noticed. When I walked into the office a few hours later, pale and wired on caffeine, Nate was waiting by my door, a stack of printouts in his hand, and the restless energy of someone who has discovered something and can't decide whether it's good news. "We need to talk," he said, skipping hello. "I was afraid of that," I replied, unlocking the door and gesturing him inside. "Tell me the Denver videos are fake. Elaborate prank. Viral marketing for some horror game. I'll take any of those." He shook his head, dropping the papers on my desk. "If they are, whoever did it is better at our jobs than we are," he said. "No signs of tampering. Metadata checks out. Compression artifacts are consistent with the hardware they're using. And there's one more thing." He slid a still image across the surface toward me. I pulled a few frames from the baby monitor footage. "See anything familiar?" The freeze frame showed Lily sitting up in bed, head turned toward a dark window. Her hand had just begun to reach out, fingers hesitating mid-air. On her wrist, in the ghostly glow of night vision, a faint circle of bright dots caught the light. At first, I thought it was just noise, a kind of digital flare that happens when pixels get confused. Then I noticed the pattern of the dots, not evenly spaced, but grouped, 3 then 2, then a single larger glint where a charm might hang. "Her parents say she never takes it off," Nate said quietly. "Got it at some holiday market last year. Blue beads, little silver snowflake." I didn't realize I'd stood up until my knees brushed the underside of the desk. The room felt smaller again, the walls inching in. 2 girls, 25 years apart, both 4 years old, both awake at the same dead hour of the night, both reaching toward windows and trees they should not have been interested in, both wearing the same kind of bracelet, as if the universe had decided to use a prop department with limited imagination. "This isn't just about what happened back then," I said, more to myself than to Nate. "It's about what's still happening. Whatever we're dealing with didn't stop with Emma. It's still recruiting." Nate swallowed. "You think something in those woods is taking kids?" I thought of Margaret's answer when I'd asked her what she believed the line was. I thought of the hollow, the hum, the way the shadow on the tape had leaned over a child like a claim. "I think," I said slowly, "that there's a place out there where our rules don't work. And I think, for some reason we don't understand yet, it likes them young, and it likes them around Christmas." He let out a shaky breath, then tried for humor and didn't quite make it. "That's one hell of a seasonal tradition," he said. "So what now? We call in a priest? A scientist? Ghostbusters? No, I said, sitting back down and pulling the main case file toward me. We do the only thing we know how to do. We follow the pattern. We talk to Lily's parents. We map out every missing child within 100 miles of a tree line in the last 50 years. We figure out how many times this thing is fed, and then I paused, feeling the weight of a decision gathering in my chest like a storm. Then we see if there's a way to make it hungry for something else. For the first time since I'd reopened the file, I allowed myself to consider a possibility that had no place in an official report, but had been circling my thoughts since I'd stepped into the hollow. If there was a door out there that sometimes opened from the wrong side, maybe, just maybe, there was a way to force it to open in our direction. And if that happened, someone would have to be standing on the threshold, ready to bargain or to fall through. Whether the first liked it or not, the case of Emma Reese was no longer just an old wound for a small town. It had become an invitation. And the thing about invitations is, eventually, someone answers them. Harper didn't say it out loud, but once you admit to yourself that something beyond your job description might be hunting children through the cracks in the world, you also have to admit that you're already in deeper than most people ever will be. The next 48 hours blurred into a pattern of motion that felt almost normal on the surface. Calls, meetings, paperwork, coffee. Underneath, everything hummed, and not just the forest. It was in my veins, in the way my ears pricked at every small sound, in the way my eyes went first, always, to any window in any room I entered. Lily's parents lived in a quiet Denver neighborhood that looked like a postcard for middle-class stability, all trimmed lawns and tasteful wreaths. I went up there under the pretense of consultation between departments, which wasn't entirely a lie. Allison met me at the station and drove the last few blocks in her unmarked sedan, her jaw working like she was chewing on something she didn't want to swallow. "You look like hell, Danny," she said, glancing at me over the steering wheel. "Sleep not on speaking terms with you these days?" "Sleep and I are seeing other people," I replied. "You watched the videos you sent me?" "Yeah," she said. "More than once. Not my best choice of late-night entertainment." She hesitated. "You really think this ties into your girl, Emma?" I thought about the bracelet on Emma's wrist, the bracelet on Lily's, the matched hour on the digital clocks. "I think," I said carefully, "that if there's even a 1% chance it does, we can't afford to treat them like separate ghost stories." Lily's mother, when she opened the door, had the look all parents get when the police arrive. A flash of fear followed by hope and then resignation, all in the space of a breath. She was in her 30s, hair pulled back in the universal style of people who no longer have time to care what they look like. Lily herself peeked from behind her mother's leg, her eyes wide and curious rather than afraid. It struck me then, as it always does, how little the very young understand the scale of the dangers sniffing around them. We did the polite dance in the living room, Allison doing most of the talking at first, soft questions about Lily's sleep, any stress at home, any relatives who might have mentioned Emma. The parents repeated what was in the report. No, they hadn't discussed the Reese case, or any other, in front of her. Yes, they had checked every lock twice over. No, there were no weird uncles whispering ghost tales at family gatherings. Lily sat on the floor with a stuffed rabbit, making it hop along an invisible path, humming under her breath. I watched her without staring, the way you do with suspects you don't want to spook. At one point, as her parents argued gently over the exact dates the episodes had begun, she looked up and met my eyes. There was a moment of blink, nothing more, where I had the distinct, irrational impression that she was evaluating me. Then she smiled, a quick, bright flash, and patted the floor next to her. "Do you want to see?" she asked. Her mother started. "Sweetie, we talked about using your inside voice when—" "It's okay," I said, easing myself down to Lily's level, my knees complaining. "See what, kiddo?" "My friend's place," she said, as if that were the most obvious thing in the world. "Where the Christmas trees are? Not the ones on TV, the ones that sing." Allison shifted on the couch, clearly torn between letting this play out and cutting it off. I gave her the smallest shake of my head and turned my attention back to Lily. "Your friend," I said. "Is her name Emma?" Lily nodded so hard her hair bounced. "Emma from the Christmas house," she said. "She doesn't like the dark forest, but she has to stay there till the man is done." I kept my face as neutral as I could. "What man?" She frowned, concentrating, the way kids do when they know an answer but can't quite grab the word. "The tall one," she said finally. "He hums. He doesn't like moms and dads. He says they talk too loud." She hugged the rabbit tighter and dropped her voice. "Sometimes he gets mad when I don't come to the window. But Emma says I shouldn't. She says he gets hungry when it's cold." Behind me, Lily's mother made a wounded noise that might have been a stifled sob. I heard Allison shift closer to her, the low murmur of reassurance. I stayed with Lily, because right then, her internal world was more important than the adult one collapsing around her. "Has Emma told you anything else?" I asked gently. "About where she is. About what happened to her." "She says she followed the lights," Lily said. "They were pretty, like Christmas, but on the ground. She says she thought it was Santa's path, but it was really the tall man's. Now she has to help him find more kids, so he'll let her go home." She glanced toward the window, her gaze sharpening for an instant. "But she doesn't want to anymore. She says you're close, and he's scared." A chill skated up my spine that had nothing to do with the thermostat. "I'm close to what?" I asked. "To the door," Lily said simply. "The one in the trees. The one that goes sideways. There are, scattered through a detective's career, a handful of sentences you know you will remember word for word until the day your brain finally checks out. That was one of mine." I thanked Lily, told her she was very brave, and suggested she show her rabbit how to build a fortress out of couch cushions while the grown-ups finished talking. She happily set to work, as if she hadn't just dropped a metaphysical bomb in the middle of her own living room. Back at the station, Allison and I sat in her office with the door closed, the blinds drawn, and a silence so heavy you could have stacked boxes on it. Finally, she scrubbed her hands over her face and swore softly. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "And for the record, I hate that I'm thinking it too." "I'm thinking," I said, "that a 4-year-old just referenced details from a 25-year-old case she has no legitimate way of knowing. I'm thinking she described the humming, the lights on the ground, and a figure that matches what we've both seen on tape. And I'm thinking that if we do nothing and she vanishes, I won't be able to live with that." "So what?" Allison shot back. "We put a SWAT team in the woods around your line? Stake out every kid's bedroom between here and there? You can't surveil a nightmare, Harper." "No," I said slowly, "but maybe you can bait it." The words were out before I'd fully weighed them, but once they were, they settled between us with the horrible, obvious weight of an idea that had been waiting for someone reckless enough to say it. Allison stared at me like I'd suggested we open a daycare center on a freeway median. "You are not seriously proposing. I'm not saying we dangle a child in the woods and see what shows up," I cut in. "I'm saying we know its pattern now. Time window, location, preference for a certain kind of victim. We've got tech, we've got people, we've got enough unofficial creative problem-solving experience between the two of us to bankrupt a therapy practice. Maybe there's a way to present it with something that looks like what it wants, from a distance, long enough to get a better look at how it moves, how it reaches, what it does when it thinks it's got a live one." She was already shaking her head. "You start playing chicken with something that drags kids through sideways doors, you're playing on its field," she said. "And you don't know the rules. You think it's just going to come sniff your fake bait and shrug and go away? What if it adapts? What if it jumps further? What if all we do is teach it new tricks? The worst part was that she wasn't wrong. Every possible plan I sketched in my head felt like poking a sleeping bear with a stick made of dynamite. But doing nothing was its own kind of suicide, slower and more socially acceptable. "I went into the line last night," I said quietly. Allison's eyes widened. "You what?" I told her, as plainly as I could, about the hollow, the hum, the figure, the blackout, the feeling of something huge and unseen sliding past. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't have to. Her face went paler with every sentence. "Jesus," she whispered when I finished. "Danny, do you have a death wish?" "Strangely, no," I said. "If anything, it's the opposite. I want fewer dead kids on my conscience, not more." She leaned back, staring at the ceiling. When she spoke again, her voice was calmer, dragged there by force. "All right," she said. "Let's pretend, for the sake of argument, that whatever you saw is real in the way that matters. Let's pretend it's tied to both Emma and Lily. You're right about one thing. We can't just sit around and hope it decides to retire. But before we start designing supernatural sting operations, maybe we should talk to someone who doesn't carry a gun for a living." "A priest?" I asked. "A priest, a physicist, a folklore professor. I don't care," she said. "Someone who spends their time thinking about doors that go sideways, so we don't have to start from a blank page." Back in Redwood Falls, there was exactly one person who might fit that description, whether she liked it or not. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Park, and she'd moved to town 5 years earlier to teach comparative myth and environment at the small college down the road. Most of the local cops wrote her off as the kind of academic who used too many syllables when simpler words would do. I wrote her off until I overheard giving a guest lecture once about liminal spaces and thin places, and the way cultures all over the world tell the same story about forests that don't just hold animals, but thresholds. She answered her office door with an expression that said she'd been expecting either a student with a late paper or a budget committee member with bad news. Getting a detective instead seemed to throw her off just long enough for me to flash my badge and ask if she could spare an hour for some questions about local folklore. Academics, in my experience, find it hard to say no to anything that sounds like their subject matter being taken seriously. Her office was an explosion of books, maps, and pinned-up notes. One corner was dominated by a corkboard covered in red string and index cards, the stereotype made flesh. It was a timeline of forest-related myths from half a dozen cultures, all converging on a central cluster labeled thresholds. I tried not to read too much into that. "You've been with the department a while," she said as we sat, clearly having looked me up online after one of the college's community outreach events. "What makes you suddenly interested in stories about haunted woods?" "Let's call it professional curiosity," I said. "Hypothetically speaking, how would your field describe a place that seems to attract disappearances, especially of children? A forest, say, that old-timers warn their kids about, not because of bears or cliffs, but because of something less tangible." She smiled a little, not the condescending smile I'd expected, but something more like recognition. "You're describing what we'd call a liminal zone," she said. "A boundary place. Crossroads, shorelines, abandoned buildings, forests at the edge of town. Places that are both one thing and another, civilization and wilderness, safety and danger, known and unknown. Human brains pay special attention to those, because that's where a lot of real-world risk lives. So we tell stories about them. Sometimes those stories get sticky." "Sticky," I repeated. "Like contagious?" "In a way," she said. "Once a place has a reputation, people behave differently around it. Kids dare each other to go there. Parents warn them away. Every odd sound or missing pet gets folded into the existing narrative. Over time, the story and the place become inseparable. In some cultures, those stories crystallize into very specific figures, guardians, monsters, spirits. In others, it's more amorphous. But the core idea is the same. There are places where the boundary between here and elsewhere feels thin. Thin how? I asked. Like, between our world and another? She shrugged, but it wasn't a dismissive gesture. It was the shrug of someone used to holding several possibilities at once. Depends how you define world, she said. Sometimes it just means between what we can explain and what we can't. Sometimes it's more literal other realms, other dimensions. Call them what you like. The important thing is, people instinctively treat those places like doors. And doors, in stories, go two ways. Any patterns? I asked, in those stories. About who or what gets taken through those doors? Children feature a lot, she said, nodding. Their symbolically powerful innocence, potential, change. Also, frankly, they're easier to scare and easier to lose track of in dangerous environments. But mythologically speaking, they're the perfect stand-ins for things being taken too soon or bargains being made. Sometimes they're lured with lights or music. Sometimes with promises. Sometimes with familiar faces. She glanced at me. You seeing any of that in your professional curiosity? I thought of Emma following lights on the ground, of Lily smiling at an empty window, of the humming that felt like a song no one could quite hear. More than I'd like, I said. She considered me for a long moment. Officer Harper, she said finally, if this is more than just hypothetical, I'm going to say something I don't usually say to authority figures. Be very careful about assuming you can outsmart a pattern that's older than your institutions. Warnings about these places aren't just primitive superstition. They're accumulated caution. People poked at something until enough of them got burned that the story became, don't poke. And if the thing being poked is still poking first? I asked quietly, if it's reaching through the door, taking what it wants? She exhaled, sitting back. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something like fear in her eyes, or at least respect for the scale of what we were circling. Then the myths usually talk about two options, she said. You move away from the door, or you send someone through on purpose, on your terms, to negotiate, to steal back what was taken, to break whatever rule is giving the other side permission. But those stories don't end with, and then everyone went home unscarred. There's always a cost. I left campus with my head louder than when I'd arrived. Driving back toward the line, I watched the trees rise ahead like the inked-in edge of a page. For the first time, I let myself phrase the question that had been forming at the back of my mind since I'd stood in that hollow. If there was a door out there, and it was already reaching into our side, what would it take for someone to step through by choice and come back? The answer, I suspected, was simple and terrible. Someone who didn't care anymore whether coming back was guaranteed. That night, I sat alone in my living room with a bracelet in its evidence bag on the coffee table, the Denver stills spread out beside it, and the map of Redwood Falls pinned to the wall across from me. In the quiet hum of my fridge and the distant rush of traffic, I could almost convince myself I heard another note underneath, a faint vibration stretching from the line all the way to the Denver suburb, where a little girl lay sleeping, maybe whispering to a friend no one else could see. There are a lot of ways to lose yourself in this job: bottles, pills, other people's beds. I'd seen colleagues choose each of them. Staring at that bracelet, at the tiny silver snowflake that had somehow walked 25 years into the future and landed in my hands, I realized I was standing at the edge of a different kind of choice entirely. It wasn't about self-destruction. It was about whether I was willing to gamble whatever years I had left on the possibility of closing a door no one else even believed was real. By the time the clock on my wall slid past midnight and toward that now familiar dead zone between 2:30 and 3, the decision had settled in me like sediment. I picked up the bracelet, felt its small, irrational weight through the plastic, and slid it into my pocket. Then I grabbed my coat, my flashlight, and a small, high-end digital recorder we used for interviews. If I was going to talk to something that lived between worlds, I wanted a record, however insane it sounded even in my own head. At 2:29 a.m., I stood once more at the edge of the line, breath puffing in front of me, the dark pressing close enough that it felt physical. "All right," I muttered, half to myself, half to whatever might be listening. "You've had 25 years to play by your rules. Tonight, we try one of mine." And I stepped into the trees, following the path I now knew by heart, toward the hollow where the hum had begun and where, one way or another, something was waiting. The walk back into the line that night felt both shorter and longer than it had before, the way familiar routes sometimes warp when you know what waits at the end. The forest accepted me with the same indifference as always, needles underfoot, branches sighing overhead, but under that, like a bass note only I had tuned into, the hum was already there. It thrummed in my jaw, behind my eyes, in the soft cartilage of my ears, as if the trees themselves were singing a song too low for ordinary listeners. I followed the same path to the hollow, my flashlight beam slicing a clean wound into the dark, and tried not to think about how stupid this would sound in any report. Senior detective re-enters haunted woods at peak supernatural feeding hour, armed with nothing but a digital recorder and a half-baked plan. When I reached the rim of the shallow depression, the snow lay again in that strange, untouched sheet, smoothed over by wind, but not, it seemed, by paws or hooves or boots. It struck me that even the animals had the good sense to give this place a wide berth. I stopped at the edge like before, unwilling to be the first to disturb the white surface. Instead, I took the recorder from my pocket, thumbed it on, and spoke into the small red light. "Case file 00R, I said, because some habits die hard. Unofficial supplemental. Location: Northern Tree Line, Redwood Falls. Time: 2:41 a.m. Subject: anomalous sight activity and possible contact attempt." Hearing my own voice steadied me, made this feel at least slightly like a procedure instead of a suicide note. I set the recorder on a flat rock just in front of my boots, then reached into my other pocket for the bracelet. Even through the plastic evidence bag, it felt colder than it had any right to be, as if it had stored some echo of that December night a quarter of a century ago, and never quite warmed up since. For a second, I hesitated, thumb on the seal, thinking of chain of custody forms and 10 different policies I was about to violate. Then I reminded myself that if this worked, policy manuals might have to be rewritten from scratch anyway, and peeled the bag open. The bracelet slid into my gloved palm, a light, ridiculous thing with its blue beads and tiny snowflake charm, an ordinary object that had somehow found its way into an extraordinary story. "You're the ticket," I murmured to it, because people talk to talismans when they're alone, even if they don't believe in them. Let's see if he's paying attention. I placed the bracelet gently on the snow at the lip of the hollow, just far enough in that I didn't have to step onto the untouched surface myself. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the hum deepened, dropping into a register that made it feel less like a sound and more like a pressure change. The hair on my arms lifted under my coat. The trees, impossibly, seemed to lean in by a fraction of an inch, their vertical lines tilting inward toward the small circle of light where the bracelet lay like an offering. "Emma," I said, pitching my voice to carry without shouting. "If you can hear me, I've brought something that belongs to you." It felt insane, grandiose, flimsy. Still, the name tasted different on my tongue out here, like it had weight. The air stilled. Even the tiny background noises of the forest, the scuttle of rodents, the occasional flutter of a night bird, faded into a kind of held breath. The hum coiled tighter, focused on the hollow like a lens. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied again, as if whatever was out here had decided to tolerate a little light in exchange for the show. For a long heartbeat, nothing changed, and I had just enough time to begin crafting the self-mocking speech I'd give myself on the walk back about stress and imagination and midlife crisis. Then, at the very center of the hollow, the snow sank slightly, as though something had just placed a foot there from the wrong direction. Not from above, not from the edge, but from below, pressing up and in at the same time. Another depression appeared a foot or two away, then another. With each one, the hum ticked up half a note, like a choir adding voices. I should have run. Every sane instinct said so. Instead, I stayed where I was, fingers clamped tighter around the flashlight until plastic creaked. The dips in the snow traced a slow, deliberate path toward the bracelet, pressing in a pattern that, if you squinted, could have been footsteps, not child-sized. Too long, too widely spaced for that. Whatever was tracing that line across the hollow walked like a tall man. When the last of the invisible steps stopped a few feet from the bracelet, the temperature dropped hard enough that my breath smoked white even faster. The air in front of me shimmered faintly, like heat above asphalt, except this was the opposite of heat. The hum was no longer background. It was all there was, a single steady vibration that made the fillings in my teeth buzz. Out of that vibrating air, something began to take shape. Not like a movie effect, no tidy fade-in of a figure from mist. It was more like a section of night had decided to remember that it had depth. At first, it was just a vertical smudge of darkness that did not belong to any tree. Then it stretched, elongated, until it was roughly human in outline. A head, shoulders too broad, arms that hung too long, legs merging into the shadowed snow. There were no features I could make out, no eyes, no mouth, no clothing, just an absence that had decided to sign up and be counted. Still, my brain, addicted to patterns, filled in some guesses. If this thing chose to wear a face, it could turn any corridor into a place you'd run from. It did not look at me, not at first. Its head tilted down toward the bracelet, the way a person might examine a coin on the ground. For an absurd second, I worried it might be insulted by the smallness of my offering. Then, without moving its feet, or what passed for its feet, it extended one of those long, not quite arms toward the snow. The air above the bracelet warped, as if a hand had passed through it. The bracelet jumped once, like a startled insect, and then slid across the snow as though dragged by invisible fingers. It rose bead by bead, until it hung in mid-air at about the height a little girl's wrist would have been. When the thing turned its attention to me, the hum shifted. Not louder, just directed. Focused the way a spotlight is, except this was a feeling rather than a beam of light. Every instinct in my body snapped to attention. There are different kinds of being watched. This wasn't curiosity. It was assessment, weighing, as if it were trying to decide what, exactly, had presented itself at the edge of its hunting ground. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. "You've had her long enough," I said. "Emma, you've had your fun. I want her back." The forest, predictably, did not answer with words. The shape, however, seemed to tilt, not its head, or its shoulders if anything. The entire presence leaned a fraction, the way a dog might when it hears an unfamiliar sound. The bracelet in the air shivered. For just a second, through whatever interference lay between us, I had the wild, irrational impression of a girl's panic threaded with hope. It did something to my chest that no doctor could have fixed. "You take kids," I went on, muscles in my arms screaming to turn and run. "You lure them. You hum to them, show them lights, send someone they trust to the window. You open a door where their world is thinnest and pull them through. Maybe they become part of you, maybe they just go, but this one?" I pointed at the bracelet, stupid, theatrical gesture that it was. "She's ours, and I'm here to offer you a trade. The word hung between us like another physical object. Trade. In every story Dr. Park had rattled off, there had been bargain sacrifices for safe passage, offerings to appease whatever watched from the other side. I didn't know if this thing understood language, but I suspected it understood intent, and intent was laced through every syllable I spoke. "Take me instead," I said. There it was, out in the open, the thought that had been quietly forming in the back of my mind since I'd watched Lily on that monitor, and listened to Margaret talk about lights in the snow. I was old enough, tired enough, guilty enough. I had no kids of my own. No one depended on me in any binding, daily way. I had a career I'd already played most of the innings of. Emma had had 4 years. Lily had had 4. The arithmetic wrote itself. "If you need someone," I continued, each word costing more than the last, "if that's the rule, if the door has to be paid to close, take me. Let her go. Let all of them go. Whatever you're feeding, feed it with something that knows what it's walking into." The shape did not move for several long seconds. The bracelet hung in the air between us, a tiny, ridiculous point of color against the snow and dark. The hum, impossibly, lowered further, until it was so deep I felt the forest floor itself trembling under my boots. For a staggering instant, I had the impression that every tree around the hollow had turned its attention toward us, their trunks now just a backdrop for something much older peering through. Then, slowly, the darkness shifted again, not forward, not backward, sideways. The air on either side of the shape bent, like glass being pressed from the other side. Something opened, not a door in the visual sense, no neat rectangle elsewhere, but a seam, a line where the world did not quite match up to itself anymore. Space around the thing looked wrong, stretched, as if the perspective had hiccuped. The smell of metal intensified, mixed now with something damp and sour that made my stomach try to crawl up my throat. Behind that seam, there was not blackness, exactly, but a sort of dim, endless gray, like looking into a hallway that refused to end. The fear that hit then was different from the prickling dread I'd felt before. It was deeper, simpler, the kind of animal terror hardwired into nervous systems long before complex language came along to dress it up. Every cell in my body screamed that if I took one step toward that wrongness, I would not be walking into another room. I would be dropping out of the category of things that happen in ordinary space and time, and into something that did not recognize me as anything but a flavor. The thing extended its arm again, toward me this time. The bracelet moved with it, hovering now halfway between us, level with my chest. A thought, unbidden, surfaced in my mind. This is the closest thing it has to a voice. No words, no grammar, just gesture. Come. Offer accepted. My knees locked. Breathing felt like trying to suck air through wet cement. Behind the fear, though, something else rose, anger, sharp and clear, at this thing that had stalked our edge for who knew how many decades, at a universe that allowed doors like this to exist and kids like Emma to vanish through them, at myself for being scared now in a way I hadn't been when I'd first volunteered. I latched onto that anger, used it like a hook to drag my voice back up. "If I go," I managed, each syllable scraping my throat raw, "they go free. That's the deal. You don't get to take me and keep them. How do you tell if something made of absence is amused? You don't, not really." But there was a subtle change in the posture of that darkness, a slight lift, like the world's worst shrug. The scene behind it pulsed, widening for a second, then narrowing again, like a mouth trying shapes. There was no answer I could hear, but the hum shifted from pure tone to something with a ripple in it, a texture almost like laughter. That, weirdly, helped. It pissed me off. "You've had 25 years to stack the deck," I said. "You hide in corners of cameras and at the edge of kids' beds. You tap windows. You cheat." Maybe you think you can take a man and keep your supply line open. But here's the thing. I didn't come alone. You're not the only one who can use a pattern. I reached into my coat again, this time pulling out the second recorder smaller, buried in an inner pocket, switched on before I'd even left the house. Redundancy, the first rule of both computing and staying alive when you plan something stupid. I held it up just enough that the dim light caught the red LED. You think you're the first thing to leave a trace? I said, we've been tracking you. The tape, the kids, the hum, the times. We're not just wandering in here barehanded anymore. Whatever happens next, we're going to understand you better than you understand us. It was a bluff, mostly. Yes, we had footage, weird reports, now my own insane field notes. No, we didn't remotely understand what this thing was, or how it chose its victims beyond the barest of outlines. But bluffing is as old as bargaining, and sometimes you don't have to fool the opponent completely. You just have to be unpredictable enough that they don't play their usual move. For a moment, the hum stuttered. The shape drew itself in slightly, as if reconsidering. The scene behind it quivered, its edges blurring more strongly, like heat waves. Then, without warning, a new sound cut through the hollow, thin and high and painfully human. "Don't!" a small voice cried. "Don't go with him." The sound hit me harder than any vibration. It was a girl's voice, strained with fear and something like urgent protectiveness. It came from the left, not from the seam, not from the shape, but from the tree line just beyond my flashlight's reach. I jerked the beam toward it, heart slamming against my ribs, and for a half second, the light fell on a figure smaller than the shadow, more solid, more familiar. A child, standing just inside the ring of trees, pajama hem brushing bare shins, hair tangled, eyes too large in a face that had known too much terror and not enough birthdays. Emma. I knew her from the photos. Even with a quarter century between then and now, facial recognition is a funny thing. The slope of her nose, the angle of her chin, the way her mouth curled when she spoke, it was all there, just as frozen as the town had kept her in every vigil candle and faded flyer. She looked neither dead nor alive in any way I understood. She looked worn thin, like a copy of a copy. But her eyes were sharp, and right now they were fixed not on the thing in the hollow, but on me. "Don't go," she repeated, voice trembling but fierce. "He doesn't let you trade. He just eats more." Behind me, the hum flared again, angry this time, discordant. The shape whipped, or what counted as whipping for something like it, between me and the tree line, as if to block the line of sight. The seam stretched wider, a pulse of gray that tugged at the edges of my vision. I had the dizzying sensation that if I stared into it any longer, I'd forget there was supposed to be a world behind me. "Run!" Emma shouted. The word broke whatever paralysis had been calcifying my muscles. I snatched the bracelet from the air, my fingers registering a brief, freezing resistance as they passed through the warped space it hung in and bolted backward, stumbling up the rim of the hollow. The hum slammed into me like a physical force, a wave that tried to trip my feet, slow my limbs, convince my inner ear that up was sideways and forward was nowhere. I pushed through, half sliding on the snow, shoulder banging into a tree trunk hard enough to spark pain. Behind me, there was a sound that didn't fit any category my brain had for noise. It was halfway between a roar and the shriek of tearing metal, layered with that awful low vibration. The trees shook, shedding a fine dusting of snow. My flashlight went out completely this time, not in a flicker, but like a switch had been thrown. For a handful of panicked seconds, I careened through near total dark, guided only by the small, irrational compass in my chest that insisted away was this direction, not that. At some point, I couldn't have said exactly when the hum dropped away like someone had cut a cable. The pressure in my ears equalized. The night sounds of the ordinary forest crept back in, cautious, as if asking permission to inhabit the soundscape again. I didn't slow down until my boots hit pavement, and I nearly collided with the hood of my own SUV. I grabbed the metal with both hands, bent over, and dragged air into my lungs like a man who'd been underwater too long. For a while, there was only the rasp of my own breathing and the frantic drum of my heartbeat. Then, gradually, other sensations filtered back, cold, stinging my cheeks. The wet weight of sweat under my shirt, despite the temperature. The small, hard shape of the bracelet pressed into my palm where I'd never let it go. I pried my fingers open just enough to see it in the weak glow of the streetlight. The beads were intact. The snowflake charm gleamed. But threaded between two of the beads now was something pale and fine, like a hair. I plucked it free carefully. It was almost colorless in this light, but when I tilted it, I saw a faint golden tint. Child fine, too short to be mine, too light to belong to anyone I knew. An irrational thought surfaced, uninvited and unwelcome. Proof of contact. Proof that someone other than me had been within reach of that bracelet after it rose into the air. My laugh, when it came, sounded strange and a little hysterical in the empty street. Proof of contact. As if the hollows and hums and impossible shadows hadn't been enough. As if I were going to march into the lab with a hair on a bracelet and demand that science sign off on my trip to the edge of whatever hell dimension squatted under our pines. Instead, I slid the hair into a fresh evidence bag from my pocket, force of habit, as a stubborn thing sealed the bracelet back in its own, and sat behind the wheel until my hands were steady enough to drive. On the way home, I found myself glancing at every window I passed, half expecting to see a small face pressed to the glass, watching the trees. More than once, I had the sense of movement in my side mirror at the edge of the road, a shift in the tree line that did not match the wind. I refused to stop the car to check. Back in my house, with all the lights on and the deadbolts slid home like that, might keep out shapes that walked sideways through seams. I played back the audio from the recorder on my table. Most of it was exactly what I remembered. My voice, steady and then not, the low hum under everything like an idling engine, the crackle of my boots in the snow as I moved. And then, just as clear as it had been in the hollow, came the thin, urgent cry. Don't go with him. Emma's voice, preserved now in digital form, tinny but unmistakably real. I listened to it 3 times, then transferred the file to a secured drive and backed it up. If this whole mess ended with me in a padded room, I wanted at least the comfort of knowing that someone, somewhere, might stumble across that recording and realize that for one brief, terrible moment, a little girl lost 25 years ago had found the breath to warn a stranger away from her captor. As the adrenaline ebbed, exhaustion hit like a truck. I made it as far as the couch before my legs refused to negotiate anymore. Sleep, when it finally came, was a fragmented mess of images. The scene opening wider, a forest of sideways doors. Lily standing in her bedroom window with the bracelet on her wrist, humming a tune I could not place. Through it all, one thought threaded, stitching itself into every dream and partial waking. He doesn't let you trade. He just eats more. In the gray light of morning, with the coffee machine burbling and the world once again pretending to be rational, I looked at the evidence laid out on my table: bracelet, hair, audio file, notes bursting out of their own margins, and realized 2 things with bone-deep clarity. 1. Whatever owned that hollow in the line was not bound by any rules I understood, but it did have rules. It had habits. It had limits, even if I couldn't see them yet. And 2, if Emma Reese, thin and half-erased as she might be, could still muster enough self to shout a warning, then she had not been entirely eaten. Not yet. Somewhere in that impossible sideways space, there was still a little girl who remembered enough of this side of the door to try to save an old cop she'd never met. And if she could do that for me, then I sure as hell wasn't done fighting for her. The morning after the second trip into the line, the world outside my windows looked so ordinary, it was almost offensive. Kids waiting for school buses with oversized backpacks, a jogger in a neon windbreaker, an old man walking a dog that looked older than he was. No one else seemed to have spent the night bargaining with something that lived in sideways seams. That's one of the stranger parts of this kind of work, how completely reality refuses to acknowledge that it almost came apart. The only signs in my house that anything had happened were the bracelet and the new evidence bag on my table, the notes scrawled in a hand that had clearly trembled, and the knowledge inside my ribs that the offer I'd made had not only been heard, but understood and mocked. At the station, I went through the usual motions. Nods in the hallway, a stack of emails, 2 phone calls about unrelated burglaries. It felt like play acting, a man wearing his own life like a costume. The one person who saw through it immediately was Nate. He showed up in my doorway mid-morning with 2 coffees, the kind he knew I hated slightly less than the others, and closed the door behind him without asking. He took one look at my face, at the dark crescents under my eyes, and the way my shoulders sat too high, and skipped the jokes. "So," he said, setting a cup in front of me, "you went back out there. And I'm guessing it didn't end with a nice campfire and some s'mores." I slid the audio recorder across the desk toward him, along with the bagged hair. "I made contact," I said. "Of a sort." He listened to the recording with his elbows on his knees, head bowed, like a man praying. When Emma's voice came through, a small, desperate, "Don't go with him," he flinched, eyes snapping to mine as if to confirm I was hearing it too. Once the file ended and the silence rushed back in, he sat up slowly and let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in his chest since midnight. "Well," he said hoarsely, "that is not on the usual list of workplace hazards." "No," I said. "It's not." He studied the hair next, brow furrowed. "You want it run?" he asked. "DNA? Mitochondrial? The whole 9? "I'm assuming yes, given your track record with bagging anything that even looks like it might shed genetic material." "Run it quiet," I said. "Off the books for now. If anyone upstairs asks why we're burning lab time on 30-year-old hair, tell them we're verifying chain of custody integrity for the Reese case." Which is technically true if you squint hard enough. He nodded, but his gaze drifted back to the recorder. "She sounds scared," he said softly. "Not just for herself. For you." "That makes one of us," I said, and it came out harsher than I intended. I tried to trade. It didn't bite. It just opened the door wider and laughed. Or whatever the hell that stuttering in the hum was. According to Emma, it doesn't do bargains. It just eats more if you offer more. Nate sat back, rubbing a hand over his mouth. "So, Plan A is off the table," he said. "What's Plan B?" "Throw the whole forest into the sun isn't an option, sadly." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. Allison's name lit the screen. My stomach dropped in that now familiar way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with how often bad timing and worse news go hand in hand. I answered on the second ring. "Tell me Lily is okay," I said, skipping any greeting. There was a pause long enough to confirm that she'd heard about the night in the woods from my late-night voicemail. "She is," Allison said, "for now. But we had another episode last night. Stronger. I thought you'd want to see the footage yourself." Of course, there was more footage. Of course, the universe wasn't going to give us a breather between encounters. I told Nate to go start the DNA run and meet me in my office later, then headed for the video room where we could pull external feeds without half the department looking over our shoulders. Allison appeared on screen a few minutes later via secure link, hair pulled back, face drawn. The family agreed to the extra interior cameras, she said by way of hello. Bedroom, hallway, living room. I know you hate the idea of turning a home into a surveillance lab, but given the alternative, wire every outlet, I said. Show me. She queued up the first video. Lily's room again, night vision green tint and all. The timestamp read 2:32 a.m. Lily lay on her side, face turned toward the wall this time, away from the window. For a short while, nothing happened. Then her body jerked, as if someone had tugged on an invisible string. She rolled onto her back, eyes still closed, lips moving. The audio, boosted in the replay, picked up the faintest whisper. Not tonight. He's mad. He's hungry. Who's she talking to? I asked, though we both knew the answer. Based on prior interviews? Allison said. Emma. A few seconds later, Lily's eyes snapped open. Unlike the earlier footage, where she had looked surprised and then almost pleased, this time her expression was tight, frightened, even before she focused on anything in the room. She stared at the ceiling first, then at the corner where the wall met the ceiling, then slowly, reluctantly at the window. Her hand, with its familiar circle of beads, crept up to her throat and rested there as if checking her own pulse. It's louder, she whispered, almost inaudible. I can't hear you when he's loud. My skin crawled. Louder how? I asked. You can't hear it? Allison shot back. Listen to the background. I did. Under the soft hiss of ambient noise and the rustle of Lily's movements, there was a low, almost subsonic vibration. The mic wasn't designed to pick up that frequency. It distorted the input slightly, like an overloaded speaker. But it was there. The same hum I'd heard under the pines, now pulsing in a suburban bedroom miles away. If that's contamination from the HVAC or a passing truck, I'll eat my badge, Allison said. On screen, Lily flinched, hands flying to her ears. Stop, she said, louder now. You're hurting Emma. Her gaze darted back toward the window, and for a split second, the camera glitched, just a line of static across the middle of the frame. It was nothing like the old VHS snow. This was a digital artifact, sharp and discreet. When it cleared, Lily was standing on the bed, one hand braced against the wall, as if she'd moved between frames. Pause, I said. Allison froze the video. Lily's face was turned partially toward the camera now, eyes wide, pupils blown. On her wrist, the bracelet beads caught the night vision glow, each one a tiny halo. Something about the way her body leaned, the tension in her legs, the angle of her shoulders, made my gut twist. I'd seen that posture once before, in the hollow, when Emma had stepped halfway into the light, torn between two gravities. Run it again from here, I said. She did. Lily's mouth moved, words spilling faster now, but the mic caught only fragments. Can't. Too close. Door. Stop him. Her hand shot out toward the window, fingers spread. There was another glitch, a brief wobble in the pixels around the glass, and then, mercifully, the door to the room opened, and her mother rushed in, flipping on the light. Instantly, the hum cut off. Lily crumpled to her knees, then into her mother's arms, sobbing the incoherent sobs of a child who has been holding in terror until an adult appears. She didn't remember much in the morning, Allison said quietly as the video ended. Just said the line in the trees is getting bigger. When I asked what that meant, she drew this. She held up a scanned page to the camera, a child's drawing in crayon. On the left, a row of houses with crooked smiles and smoke curling from their chimneys. On the right, a dense cluster of vertical green lines trees, presumably. Between them, a thick black smudge that started as a line and widened into a fat bar, like someone had dragged the crayon back and forth until the paper nearly tore. In the middle of that dark band, a small, stick-figure girl in a triangle dress stood with her arms outstretched. Behind her, a taller, shapeless figure loomed, scribbled in so hard the wax had gone shiny. I thought your door was in one forest, Allison said. Now I'm wondering if the forest is just the part we can see. Maybe the door is bigger, longer, like a crack that runs under everything between your town and mine. The idea made my stomach flip, not because it was any stranger than what we'd already encountered, but because it fit too well. A scene, Dr. Park had called it. A place where the world didn't quite line up. What if the line wasn't just a border around Redwood Falls, but a visible stretch of a much longer fracture? What if kids like Emma and Lily, living near forests or parks or any scrap of uncultivated land, were just points of access along the same fault? If that's true, I said slowly, then this isn't just our problem or yours. It's any town with a patch of dark and a lonely kid. Don't say that, Allison muttered. I'm barely holding on to the illusion this is containable as is. Containable or not, I said, it has a feeding pattern. Christmas, give or take. Cold months, late hours, forest edges. If we can map the hum where it's strongest, when it spikes, we might get ahead of it instead of always showing up afterward. She eyed me through the screen. You want to build a seismograph for hauntings? I shrugged. Dr. Park would probably call it a threshold resonance monitor or something with more syllables. But yeah, Nate can rig audio sensors. You can place some near your tree line. I'll cover ours. If that hum shows up in multiple places at once, we trace its path. We treat it like a natural phenomenon with very unnatural tastes. Allison was quiet for a moment, weighing. Fine, she said finally. I'll talk to my chief about a multi-jurisdictional acoustic survey and leave out the part where we're spying on a child eating space crack. You loop in your tech guy, and please, for the love of my blood pressure, no more solo trips into the woods. I didn't promise. I told myself it was because I didn't want to lie to her, not because part of me already knew I'd go back if the pattern demanded it. By the end of that day, we had equipment orders in motion and a rough plan. Sensor arrays at strategic points along the line and at the patch of woods near Lily's subdivision, all feeding into a shared server Nate had locked down with every security protocol he knew. It felt almost comforting, wrapping the incomprehensible in the familiar language of data points and graphs. If we could make the hum into a waveform, we could study it. If we could study it, maybe we could interrupt it. That night, for the first time in a while, I went to see Dr. Park, not as a skeptic mining her for metaphors, but as someone who needed her frame of reference more than he wanted to admit. I told her about the hollow, the shape, Emma's warning, the failed bargain, the way the hum now threaded through another child's sleep in another town. I left out nothing, partly because I was too tired to filter, and partly because I suspected that whatever theoretical line I'd been trying to walk between cop and lunatic had already been erased. She listened without interrupting, eyes intent, fingers steepled. When I mentioned the door opening sideways and the feeling of space going wrong, she nodded slowly as if an internal checklist was clicking over. You're describing exactly the kind of thing people have reported for centuries, she said when I finished. Not in the details. No one in a medieval village talked about hum frequencies, but in the structure. A place that is not a place. A passage that is not a hallway. A presence that feeds or takes in exchange for something. Sometimes it's framed as a bargain, sometimes as a punishment, sometimes as sheer predation. The question is always, what gives it the right? The right? I repeated. You mean rules? She leaned forward. Even monsters have rules, she said. Not moral ones, but functional. A pattern that repeats the precisely same ages, same time of year, same kind of location suggests constraints. And if we figure out those conditions, I said, we can? What? Starve it? Trick it? Seal it? Maybe, she said. Or maybe we learn enough to decide where not to stand when the tide comes in. You said you tried to trade. That's interesting. Interesting isn't the word I'd choose. I muttered. In the stories, she continued, ignoring that, voluntary sacrifice changes the equation. It can disrupt a pattern built on fear and helplessness. A child pulled screaming from their bed is one thing. A grown man walking awake toward the door is another. It sounds like your entity didn't appreciate that. It doesn't want equal parties at the threshold. It wants prey. So my big noble gesture just annoyed it, I said. Good. I was worried I might have done something smart for once. She smiled briefly, then sobered. You said the girl Emma warned you off. That's remarkable. If she's been in that in-between for as long as you think, retaining that much self is no small feat. It suggests that whatever this thing does, it doesn't completely erase its victims. It uses them. As intermediaries. As bait. Maybe as anchors. Anchors? I asked. To keep the door open, she said. Every passage needs a frame. Every story needs a protagonist. If it eats them entirely, it loses its handles on this side. She hesitated, which raises a possibility you're not going to like. At this point, I said, I collect possibilities I don't like. Hit me. If Emma is an anchor, she said, removing her might destabilize the door. Either close it or break it. But whatever you do to that connection, the thing on the other side will fight it. Hard. I pictured the scene behind the shadow, the way it had pulsed when I made my offer, the mocking ripple in the hum. Any suggestions on how one removes a girl from the stomach of a trans-dimensional predator without, killing her again? I asked. She spread her hands. If I were writing this as a paper, she said, I'd say something about narrative inversion. Stealing back what was taken by recreating the conditions of the theft, but on your terms. In plain language, if she was taken from a bedroom window in the middle of a humming night, maybe you bring her back through a bedroom window in the middle of a humming night with protection, with witnesses, with someone willing to step between her and whatever tries to pull her the other way. It's not, she answered. And I'm an academic, not a field operative. But if you're looking for a mythic blueprint, that's the closest I've got. Repeat the pattern, break the outcome. On the drive home, her words looped in my head. Repeat the pattern, break the outcome. It sounded like something you'd hear in a self-help seminar if you stripped out the ghosts. But applied to our situation, it meant something more specific and more terrifying. Stage the conditions of Emma's disappearance, only this time, don't let her go through alone. The idea lodged itself in me, like shrapnel. I didn't like it. I didn't trust it. But when I tried to imagine any other scenario where Emma emerged from that sideways seam into our world, alive enough to call her own name, my imagination came up empty. Every other path ended with more missing kids, more grieving parents, more cold files. This one at least offered a picture that wasn't entirely bleak. A bedroom, a window, a girl stepping out of the dark instead of into it. I didn't sleep that night either. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table again with the bracelet and my notes, sketching out the logistics of a plan that would sound insane to anyone who hadn't heard a child's voice echo out of a haunted forest. We needed a room with a window facing the line, or at least within range of its hum. We needed monitoring, both technological and human. We needed the hum itself, which meant timing it near the peak of whatever cycle this thing operated on. And we needed a willing point of contact, someone the door wanted, someone it already knew. The realization came so quietly, I almost missed it. It already had one. Lily. The thought of involving her any further than she already was made my stomach churn. She was 4. She should have been thinking about picture books and cereal choices, not trans-dimensional doorways. But she was also already on the radar of whatever lurked along the crack between our towns. It was already using her as a potential meal ticket. If we did nothing, it would keep coming for her window, humming louder until the night she was tired or lonely or curious enough to step forward. Repeat the pattern, Break the outcome, I muttered to the empty room, or watch it repeat itself with a different girl. By dawn, the rough bones of the plan were on paper. By mid-morning, Allison and I were on another secure call, her expression moving through disbelief, anger, fear, and grudging, exhausted acceptance as I laid it out. By noon, we'd both said the same terrible sentence within 5 minutes of each other. If we talk to her parents about this, we can't lie. They have to know every risk. The conversation with Lily's parents that followed was, without exaggeration, one of the hardest of my life. Harder than delivering death notifications in some ways, because at least then the worst had already happened. This time, we were asking two people to stand on the edge of that worst-case scenario and choose between passive risk and active, structured terror. We told them everything, about the line, about Emma, about the hollow and the hum, about the way Lily's experiences mirrored Emma's down to the hour and the beads on her wrist. We explained, as gently as possible, that their daughter was already in the crosshairs. Her mother cried quietly, gripping her husband's hand so hard his knuckles went white. Her father asked blunt, practical questions in a voice that only shook once. What happens if this goes wrong? What if we just move away? What if we burn the forest? What if we stop calling her by name? Every answer felt inadequate. Move away, and the crack might follow, or just pick another child in another town. Burn the forest, and you might destroy the only visible marker we have for where the door likes to open, without touching the seam underneath. Stop calling her by name, and you only blindfold yourself. In the end, the decision wasn't made in words. Lily, who had been coloring quietly at the table, listening more than any of us wanted to admit, got up, walked over to her parents, and slid her small hand into her mother's. "Emma's scared," she said simply. "She says he's almost done choosing. If we don't help now, he won't need her anymore." Her mother's face crumpled, then hardened around the edges. She looked at me, then at Allison. "If we say no," she asked, "will you still try something on your own? Without her?" "Yes," I said, because any other answer would have been a lie and a betrayal. "We have to. But without Lily, our chances of reaching Emma drop, and your chances of keeping her safe don't necessarily go up. This thing already has her number." She closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them, wet but clear. "Then we do it," she said. "But on one condition. If at any point you think this is about to go sideways beyond what you can handle, you pull her out. I don't care if that means you lose your shot. You pull her out." "I swear," I said. "On whatever you want me to swear on." Her husband nodded once, short and sharp, like a man signing on for a mission he hated. "Tell us what you need," he said. What we needed, in the end, was painfully simple. Lily's room, wired and watched, a link back to our monitors in Redwood Falls. The bracelet as a bridge between Emma and this side. The bracelet alone, if necessary. What we couldn't order from a catalog was the hardest part. Courage. Theirs. Emma's, if she could muster it from the wrong side of the seam. And maybe, if it came to it, mine. The night we picked 2 days before Christmas, the anniversary window when Emma had vanished was cold, clear, and deceptively calm. As the hour approached, screens blinked to life in both our towns. Sensor readouts for the hum, camera feeds from Lily's room and hallway, audio channels all open. In Redwood Falls, Nate sat in front of the console with headphones on, fingers poised over manual overrides. In Denver, Allison stood just outside Lily's door with 2 uniformed officers and Lily's parents. I, thanks to technology and the inexplicable decision of someone higher up to approve remote, consultative presence, watched from my own dim office, the bracelet in its bag on the desk in front of me. On one monitor, Lily sat cross-legged on her bed, clutching her rabbit, eyes on the window. On another, the waveform from the audio sensors near the line showed only the usual environmental noise. For a while, It stayed that way. The minutes between 2:20 and 2:30 stretched like taffy. Then, at 2:32, the first low rise appeared on the waveform, a gentle swell where there should have been flatline. Nate straightened in his chair. "Here we go," he murmured into the shared channel. "Primary sensor is picking up something at 10 hertz and dropping. That's not traffic. That's our guy clearing his throat." On screen, Lily flinched slightly, head cocking as if she'd just heard someone calling her name from the next room. She looked at the window, then at the corner near the ceiling, then, bless her brave, stubborn little heart, at the camera. "He's humming," she said, voice steady but small. "Emma says get ready." I took a breath. I hoped the mic wouldn't catch, and leaned closer to my own camera. "Lily," I said, keeping my tone as even as I could, "you're doing great. You remember what we talked about. You don't open the window. You don't get off the bed unless your mom comes in. You talk to Emma, and if anything feels wrong, you say so out loud, 'We're all here.'" She nodded solemnly. "He doesn't like that you're here," she said. "He says you're noisy." "Good," I said. "Tell him I've been called worse." The hum climbed, a steady, insistent rise on the graph. In the hallway camera, a hairline crack of shadow seemed to thicken under the door, as if the dark beyond it had decided to pool. The light in Lily's room flickered once, twice, then steadied. Somewhere in Denver, Allison muttered a prayer under her breath. Somewhere in Redwood Falls, in a hollow ringed by pines, the snow might have been sinking under invisible feet again. I didn't look at the mapping overlay. I kept my eyes on Lily, on the beads around her wrist, on the small squint of concentration between her brows. "Emma's here," she whispered suddenly. Her gaze shifted slightly to the left of the camera, to a space that on screen looked fiercely empty. "She says she can see your forest and mine at the same time. She says the line is in the middle of both." The sensor graph spiked. The hum, now clearly audible even through the speakers, flooded the audio channel. A low, thrumming roar that made the mic levels jump. On the video feed, for just a heartbeat, the space by Lily's window shimmered, the same wrongness I'd seen in the hollow, the same stretching of space. A faint vertical ripple traced itself in the air, like someone had drawn a line with invisible ink and then started to pull it open. "Doorway forming," Nate said tightly. "Signature matches the profile from the forest." This is it. On my desk, the bracelet seemed to vibrate inside its plastic prison. I grabbed it, feeling the cold radiate into my skin even through the bag. "Emma," I said into the mic, into the humming air, into whatever sliver of overlapping space might carry my voice. "If you can hear me, if you can see both sides, this is your shot. Follow her voice, not his. Follow the light, not the humming. We've got you." Of course, there were no guarantees. There rarely are, outside of fairy tales. But as the scene near Lily's window widened, and the hum wrapped itself around the room like hands around a throat, and a small girl on a bed reached instinctively for a friend only she could see, it felt for the first time since I'd opened her dusty case file that we were not just chasing Emma's ghost. We were standing at the same door that had taken her, and this time we had names, tools, witnesses, and a choice. Whether that would be enough to pull her back, or whether the thing behind the humming would simply decide to add us all to its menu, was a question the next few minutes were going to answer. The minutes after Emma and Lily stepped through that shimmering threshold felt like a suspended heartbeat, a fragile pause between two worlds. The hum that had filled every corner dropped abruptly, fading into an uneasy silence that wrapped around us like a second skin. On the monitors, the gray ripple at the window vanished, leaving nothing but an ordinary view of the suburban night. For a moment, none of us dared to breathe, as if the act itself might unravel the fragile thread on which their passage now hung. In Denver, Lily clung to her mother, wide eyes still reflecting the ghosts she had just touched. Emma, The fragile, silvery shadow now walked among us, more real and less certain with every second that passed. A child out of time, carrying the weight of all she had lost, and all she had left behind. She looked around the room as if trying to remember a place that had changed shape while she was gone, eyes searching the faces that watched her with a mix of awe, fear, and hope. Back in Redwood Falls, Nate stared at the readouts with disbelief, fingers frozen above the keyboard. The sensors showed a dramatic drop in the mysterious hum near the line, and a corresponding spike in localized energy that we could only guess was the doorway collapsing itself behind them. It was as if the barrier between worlds, just moments ago torn open, was now retreating, closing in on whatever secrets it kept nested in its depths. Allison's voice crackled over the secure line. Did it work? Did she come back? Emma's first words, fragile and uncertain, answered it better than any report. I'm here. We had no illusions that the danger was over. What we'd witnessed was not a rescue so much as a ceasefire, a pause in a game we barely understood. The shadow, the hum, the consuming hunger, these were forces older than any street or town, bound not by our laws, but by rules we had yet to decipher. Emma's reawakening brought more questions than answers. How long had she existed on the other side of the door? What had she seen? What had she lost? And most hauntingly, what had followed her back? The days that followed the crossing were a blur of intensive care, psychological evaluations, and forensic analysis. Emma's memories came in shards, fleeting images of endless shadows, cold whispers, and a voice that told her to wait, to stay silent, as if speaking could bring the darkness closer. Lily's presence, a beacon bridging two realities, gave her strength. The bond of their shared experience created cracks in the shadow's grasp, spaces where light could peek through. But the door, the seam, the line itself still whispered promises of return, threats wrapped in the hum that now pulsed faintly in the walls around us. The investigation took on a new urgency, a race not just to understand what we had faced, but to prepare for what might still come. With Dr. Park's insights guiding us, Nate's technical expertise weaving a net of sensors and monitors, Allison's relentless coordination, and my own stubborn resolve, we moved from reaction into strategy. There were plans to document, to test, to push the boundaries of science and myth, to map the thin places where our world frayed, and to protect those naive enough to wander too close. The bracelet, once a symbol of loss, became an emblem of hope, a tangible thread connecting past and present, the known and unknown. As Emma slowly relearned the world she had been torn from, and as Lily adjusted to sharing her friend with realms unseen, I realized our journey was far from over. The door might have closed, but the story, their story, was just beginning. And somewhere in the dark folds of the line, the hum waited, biding its time. The days after Emma's return were a strange dance of light and shadow between two worlds. Emma, fragile and hesitant, relearned life piece by piece, a world that had moved on without her, and a place she barely recognized as home. Lily, anchor and bridge, stayed close, a fierce protector with eyes that knew too much for her age. The hum near the line never disappeared completely. It pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the town, softer now, muted but persistent, a reminder that the door might have closed, but the seam remained. Dr. Park's words echoed in my mind. Every door leaves a crack, every threshold retains a whisper. For us, life returned to an uneasy normal. The investigation intensified, mapping thin places, refining monitors, training families to watch, to listen, to guard children who might unknowingly share invisible borders. I stayed on the case longer than I planned, driven by the shadow of what we had seen and the fragile light we brought back. One cold evening, standing beneath familiar pines, I traced the line of the forest edge where the door had opened. It was just a tree now, old and silent, with snow gathering on its branches. The wind carried a faint hum, the echo of something waiting, patient, watching. I touched the bracelet in my coat pocket, a token of the impossible journey that changed everything I thought I knew about loss, fear, and hope. Opening that case file was the beginning. Closing it would be another story, written with vigilance and quiet courage. Because some doors, once opened, don't close easily. Some horizons don't fade, but shift, waiting for the next step beyond the thin line where worlds meet. And we stay ready.